Now, we want to conclude with expressions from two friends of mine, long-time, hardworking supporters of the faithful slave for decades. I love these men, and we'll keep it anonymous, but I asked them to write their personal feelings, because they've been supporting the slave for all these decades. How have they benefited from keeping on the watch? So here's what the first one said. I come from a long line of people who believed in keeping an expectation of the end. My mother died just last year, and she always felt that the end was close at hand. She just knew that she would live to see it, but she didn't. She had first learned the truth from her mother-in-law, my grandmother, an anointed Christian who often told me that she hoped to see the end come in her lifetime. She didn't. She had learned the truth from her mother, who died when I was a teenager, and firmly believed she would see the end in her lifetime. She didn't. And she, my great-grandmother, had learned the truth from her mother-in-law, who died long before I was born, and surely felt the same way about seeing the end. She didn't. And here I am now in my 7th decade of life, firmly believing that I will see the end very soon. So what does that mean?
It means you've been conned. How heartbreaking is this letter? How can they not see that they're repeating the mistakes of past generations? These, by the way, are the concluding remarks of governing body member Anthony Morris, speaking right at the end of the 2021 annual meeting. His theme, Why Keep on the Watch? And he's reading us 2 letters from people he has asked, presumably people he knows. He's asked these people to submit letters about the importance of keeping on the watch and how it's benefited them. And again, all we're seeing here is a heartbreaking reminder of how generational this delusion is, how it swallows up people's entire lives so that they can go right into their old age expecting Armageddon to come at any moment, even though previous generations of their family, people they knew and loved, were expecting the same thing and died expecting it. And they just go to their graves believing that Armageddon is just around the corner, not thinking for a moment, maybe I've been lied to. Maybe I've been hoodwinked, just like previous generations who died waiting for something that was never coming.
So what does that mean? That I'm just another one in a long line of delusional people? I don't think so, for 2 reasons. One, the evidence that the end is near keeps growing. I've seen signs of the end that even my mother never saw, such as the recent pandemic. Sometimes I compare myself to a man living in Judea around the year 608 BCE. Such a man might have come from a long line of faithful people who had listened to the prophets and thought that the end was near. Over a century earlier, hearing these things. And maybe his great-grandparents might have heard Isaiah speak, leading them to conclude that Jerusalem's end was near. Should that man decide that his family had been deluded just because they hadn't seen the destruction of Jerusalem? No. Jerusalem was destroyed in 607. So see, he's living 608, having these concerns. Months later, it happens. But more importantly, that man would know that his faithful family were good people who lived good lives. They loved Jehovah, and they saw the truth of Isaiah's words. God teaches us to benefit ourselves. And that's the second reason why I don't feel that I've been deluded or that my faithful family members have been. Each one who served Jehovah led a good, productive, useful life. They were not just sitting around waiting for the end. They always had projects that kept them busy in Jehovah's service, goals in personal study and preaching and helping others. So they were full of purpose and joy. I want the same kind of life. Also, I can hardly wait to tell my mother, it's touching, just how close the end was when she finally closed her eyes. I know she will want to hear all about it. See, very touching.
What we've just heard are 3 terrible reasons for persisting in the Jehovah's Witness religion, despite how abusive it is and despite the failed predictions, the failed doomsday predictions. As you'll have seen on the screen there, reason number 1, there's a pandemic. As though there's never been a pandemic before in history. As though there have never been plagues. As though there have never been deadly pathogens in all of Earth's history until now. That's apparently a reason to believe not just that the world is ending, but that the world is ending according to Jehovah's Witness expectations, so that any moment now, the whole world will be terraformed, billions of people will be slaughtered, and Tony Morris and Stephen Lett and David Splain will rule over the earth, rule over an earth where everyone who's ever lived, pretty much, gets resurrected. All of this we can deduce from the existence of the coronavirus pandemic. It's a self-evidently preposterous line of reasoning. Then we have the line of reasoning that, oh, well, if you'd been living in Jerusalem in 608, a year before the destruction, we know Jerusalem wasn't destroyed, by the way, in 607 BCE. Thumbnail here to my video on 607 if Tibor is gracious. But for the sake of argument, say you'd been living in 608 BCE, the year before the destruction, and you'd come from a long line of people who'd listened to the prophets, who'd prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, and as far as they were concerned, it still hadn't happened, but it would happen only a year later. I find it very interesting that Tony Morris is here indulging a direct comparison between the Jehovah's Witness organization and Bible prophets.
Sometimes I compare myself to a man living in Judea around the year 608 BCE. Such a man might have come from a long line of faithful people who had listened to the prophets and thought that the end was near. Over a century earlier, hearing these things. And maybe his great-grandparents might have heard Isaiah speak, leading them to conclude that Jerusalem's end was near.
So apparently we should think of Tony Morris and the rest of the governing body members as being prophets. That's the comparison that's being drawn here. My question would be, what does the Bible have to say regarding prophets who prophesy something and it doesn't come true? Let's go again to Deuteronomy 18, verse 20. If any prophet presumptuously speaks a word in my name that I did not command him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. Verse 21. However, you may say in your heart, how will we know that Jehovah has not spoken the word? Verse 22. When the prophet speaks in the name of Jehovah, and the word is not fulfilled or does not come true, then Jehovah did not speak that word. The prophet spoke it presumptuously. You should not fear him. Remember, we're comparing the faithful slave, Jehovah's organization, with Bible prophets who supposedly predicted the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. I'm a bit skeptical that Bible prophets did predict this. I think that the Bible books were written much later in history than people generally give them credit for. This has been established or is being established by Bible scholars. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem were not written after the fact, that they were predicting something that would happen. Well, according to this verse in Deuteronomy, people would have every right to look upon Isaiah and Jeremiah as being legitimate prophets because they prophesied something and it happened. What's the track record for Jehovah's Witnesses? If you examine their literature going back 140 years, how many times have they predicted Armageddon? Not just vaguely as in, oh, it's just around the corner, oh, it's imminent, but on a number of occasions, they've pinned it down to a specific year or a specific period in time. Thumbnail here, if Tibor is gracious, for a video I made regarding Armageddon predictions in the organization's publications. They predicted Armageddon by the end of 1914. They predicted Armageddon for 1925. They predicted Armageddon for 1975. And the prediction I grew up with was that Armageddon would come before the generation of people old enough to observe and understand the events of 1914 died off. I was baptized on that teaching. That teaching, like all of the others, was quietly squirreled away. Oh, well, that's old light. We've come up with new light now. And yeah, forget what we were saying about these specific periods in history, in some cases specific years that have been and gone. Just forget about all that and focus on what we're promising now, which is a bit more vague because we've learned our lessons from the past. Well, according to the verses in Deuteronomy, if you predict something and it doesn't come true, you are a false prophet. And there's a rather damning penalty, a rather final penalty for those who do prophesy falsely. Not advocating that that the governing body should be executed, by the way, just to be absolutely clear. But the Bible was unequivocal in condemning those who prophesy falsely. So isn't it interesting that Tony Morris is here indulging a letter that's comparing him and his organization with the prophets of old, even though we have a damning track record of failure after failure after failure. So I'm sorry, I don't accept the comparison. And the final point in this letter from one of Tony Morris's friends is, oh, at least it keeps me busy.
Each one who served Jehovah led a good, productive, useful life. They were not just sitting around waiting for the end. They always had projects that kept them busy in Jehovah's service, goals in personal study and preaching and helping others. So they were full of purpose and joy. I want the same kind of life.
If it's just about keeping busy, I'm pretty sure there are any number of things you can do to keep busy that don't involve perpetuating lies and supporting an abusive and exploitative organization. That's not helping others. We heard in this talk Tony Morris say that it wasn't helpful for people to be telling young ones that they would never graduate due to the nearness of Armageddon, even though it said that in the publications at that time. So even Tony Morris apparently recognizes that perpetuating lies or sensationalizing things is not helpful. By extension, how is it helpful to go around in your community knocking on people's doors and trying to get them roped into something that isn't true? Oh, well, at least it keeps me busy. If being busy is so important to you, find a hobby. Take up stamp collecting, do train watching, I don't care. Do something that's not going to hurt people. Do something where you're not lying to children. Because even if you don't have children as a Jehovah's Witness, when you go out in the preaching work, who's to say you're not going to knock on the door of a parent and bring them into the organization so that the parent then has to lie to their children and a new generation ends up getting roped in? Either it's true or it's not true. Whether it keeps you busy or not is frankly irrelevant. And I find it funny that this is an argument that's being read out at the annual meeting, because you sometimes hear this argument when you're speaking to Jehovah's Witnesses or Jehovah's Witness apologists. Oh, it's the best life ever. Even if it weren't true, I love the lifestyle of being a Jehovah's Witness. If it's not true, then your lifestyle involves lying to people. How is that something to be proud of? And yet Tony Morris thinks this is such a good argument, he's including it in the final talk at the 2021 annual meeting.
And our second brother, about how keeping on the watch has benefited him. My mom raised my brother and me in the truth. She often expressed to us her confidence that the end is just around the corner. She didn't just say it, she lived it. She devoted herself to the ministry so that she could help others to serve Jehovah while there is still time. She kept an expectation of the end, doing so year after year until she died. Now I'm approaching the age of my mother when she died. I've been keeping on the watch for over 50 years now. Am I bitter because the end has not yet come? No, not at all. How could I be? I've lived a full and satisfying life by living according to Jehovah's standards. Why would I want to live any other way? What has helped me to keep positive while waiting for the end to come? From time to time, I reflect on these few things, and here they are. My dedication is unconditional and unending. I did not dedicate myself to Jehovah on the condition that he brings the end within my lifetime, or even on the condition that he gives me a reward. I dedicated myself to him forever. And next, I must keep the big picture in mind. I don't want to make the mistake of focusing only on what the end will mean for me, the prospect of surviving into the new world. Rather, I must focus on something far more important, what the end will mean for Jehovah, the sanctification of his name. Knowing how important that is to him, I can be sure that it will happen in his due time. And then finally, meanwhile, I must endure to the end. That means to the end of this system or the end of my life, whichever comes first. Either way, the older I get, the closer I am to the end. What if, like my mom, I don't live to see it? No worries. The moment I close my eyes in death, my next conscious thought will be opening my eyes in the new world. Then it really won't matter whether I live to see the end or not. Beautiful expressions of two beautiful spiritual men.
I honestly look on those expressions as being anything but beautiful. They're tragic. They're really, really sad. We have people who've wasted decades, in the case of this last example, over 50 years, waiting for something that was never coming and lying to themselves and others about how worthwhile it was. There in that last example, we have 3 more reasons for sticking it out as a Jehovah's Witness, even though you have decades of experience that it's not the truth, decades of failed expectations, decades of broken promises. Reason number 1 there was essentially a rehashing of reason number 3 from the previous letter, which was, at least it keeps me busy. Well, let's reword that slightly. I've led a full and satisfying life. Doesn't matter whether it's true. Doesn't matter whether I've spent decades lying to people and lying to myself. At least I feel I've had a full and satisfying life. Again, how is it a full and satisfying life if you've wasted it believing something that isn't true? Ultimately, the question must be, is it true or is it not true? And saying things like, at least it keeps me busy, I've led a full and satisfying life, is just dancing around that central question of, yes, but is it true or not? If it's not true, then it doesn't matter whether it's keeping you busy, and it doesn't matter whether you feel you've led a full and satisfying life. You've been wasting your time, and you've been wasting the time of everyone you've been preaching to, especially those who you've duped into joining you in the cult. Second reason, I promised I'd never leave. Once I've dedicated myself on the basis of bad information, on the basis of lies, once I have been tricked into joining a doomsday cult, well, that's it. You know, my hands are tied because I made a promise. Oh, that's essentially what anyone in an abusive, toxic relationship could say, isn't it? Oh, well, I married him. Doesn't matter that he's making my life a living nightmare. I promised I'd stay with him, so I'd better stick it out even if it kills me. I'm sorry, bad reason. Bad reason to stay in a toxic situation. If you've been tricked into something, if you have been manipulated into joining a group based on lies and based on bad information, you have every right to leave. You would never have gotten involved in the first place if you knew the full story, if everything had been explained to you, if there was full transparency. And when you think about it, isn't it interesting how they don't lead with any of these arguments? All of the arguments we're hearing towards the end of the annual meeting in this talk by Tony Morris, these are all arguments for people who were duped into joining decades ago, have had their expectations not met, and are now making extra reasons that bear no relation to the reasons they joined to begin with. So when Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door, they're not saying, do you want to be busy? Do you want to lead a full and satisfying life? They're not leading with that stuff, are they? They're leading with all the promises of global peace and security. They're leading with pandas and watermelons and wouldn't you like to live in a paradise? None of these excuses are part of their opening pitch. And that tells you a great deal about this organization. When you watch their elite event where they're talking among themselves, and particularly people who've been in the organization for decades are explaining why they're still involved, if those reasons bear very little relation to their sales pitch, you know something's not quite right. You know there's some trickery afoot. And the third reason, God's name, this is how I've paraphrased the argumentation, God's name is more important than my wasted life. Who am I? I'm just dirt. I'm just a lowly human. I'm a creation of God. It's not my place to feel disappointed at failed predictions, at failed promises. Ultimately, Jehovah is the only thing that matters in the universe, and his reputation comes first before anything, so it's not my place to feel disappointed. You can buy into that reasoning if you want. I would suggest, again, these are just the terrible arguments you claw around for and scrape from the bottom of the barrel once you've capitulated, once you've ultimately realized that you've been conned. The sunk cost fallacy is well and truly kicked in, and you realize you just have to stick it out whether it's true or not.